I just want to make sure you were here.
That's Siberia, isn't it?
Mother of a
That's a
child.
classic South Vietnamese coffee. I'm Norteña Pearl.
Yeah.
You can take the Corona Norteña, but you can't take the Norteña.
Oh, this is like when the show's gonna start?
Oh, yeah, we love that.
Good morning.
Excuse me, Alex.
I think we have 2 more lectures after this one, just so you guys know, and there'll be more in the fall, but this is not the last one. But we're gonna switch gears and talk about Latin America today and Catholicism. Yeah, no worries. I'm just kind of getting on keeping the natives from getting too restless. Why were you guys talking about Larry, Moe, and Curly? Was the Three Stooges something that just came up randomly? I remember that growing up. It's definitely on the sort of frontier of my memory growing up, but I do remember it. I'm just one of those shows that I would say is probably very offensive to a lot of people today. And that's why they don't do reruns anymore. I don't know why. I'm just gonna go on a limb there. Like the Little Rascals, I'm sure was incredibly offensive too. Now, anyhow, so is everything, right? Except my lecture. My lectures aren't offensive.
We're good.
All right, we're good. All right, so we were talking about, we've been talking about European art, Christianity, Catholicism mainly, and of course, it's important to understand that right around the time we're talking about this, you've got that break from Catholicism, which is Martin Luther and the critique of the sale of indulgences. And while all that is going on, you also have this conquest of the New World, which I think is important to talk about because it's, they're not necessarily related. I don't think Martin Luther was really, I don't think his theses had anything to do with Columbus or the conquest of the New World, and yet a very important kind of change is taking place because you have the discovery of this new continent, and of course that presents a lot of problems. What kind of problems do you think that presents when, well, first Columbus had to realize, oops, it's not India, right? I don't know when he, at some point, I'm guessing after he arrived, maybe a day later, after he set foot in Hispaniola or Cuba, someone was like, I've been looking at this, we made it. Thank you, Columbus. We got here. We have food now. We're safe, right? But I don't think we're in India, right? At some point, someone, it dawned on him we're not in India, right? And that's important, that's certainly I don't think you can discredit for him for, because it wasn't India. But nevertheless, he realized there's a whole new continent with people that aren't Indian. They are, from India, as in. So I think he really had to kind of figure out what to do, especially those who came after him. What do we do, particularly? Well, what do you think the big problem is for the newly arrived Spaniards? What kinds of things do you think they're confronting after they realize, okay, we're not in India?
Naked heathens.
What's that?
Naked heathens.
Naked heathens. Very good. I think we'll see some pictures of that, right? So I think there's a very fascinating parallels to the Garden of Eden, right? With the idea of kind of clothlessness, right? And of course, also you might think about monogamy, how that relates to Christianity. What's another one? Well, sacrifice, human sacrifice, right? Christianity had to deal with that throughout the millennia. Of course, Romans had sacrifice. You've seen Gladiator, so you all know what I'm talking about. Sacrificing people in public is certainly something I think Christians, of course, Jesus is kind of an exceptional case there. And I think thereafter the idea is, you elevate human life and you don't sacrifice it. That's kind of a pagan practice. And so after Columbus, you have a bunch of, I think there are conquistadors, but also along with the conquistadors, the conquerors come, friars, people like Bartolome de las Casas and others who are looking at the conquest with, I think with more criticism because they understand that, there's something anti-Christian about treating the natives ruthlessly, right? So there's a real dilemma when it comes to what do we do with this sort of cultural clash between these two groups, right? And of course, behind all that is this kind of question of, Catholicism and the future of Catholicism. And it doesn't necessarily relate to Protestantism, but I think it's very important to understand because, of course, Columbus and the others bring smallpox, which, spreads throughout the New World and reaches, up here in North America. And so by the time the British arrived, and I mean the people seeking, sanctuary, the Puritans arriving in 1600s, they really have already, the Native American populations have already been pretty much wiped out. Not completely, but it's a different sort of world than the ones the Spanish arrived. And so even though we're talking about the Catholics, just remember in a few hundred years, we're going to have the Protestants arrive to the New World. And that sets up a real interesting contrast between the Spanish Latin America and the United States. And I think that continues today with this, sort of the border being this sort of insurmountable cultural divide, linguistic divide between, Mexico and Latin America and the United States. Of course, that's slowly kind of vanishing, but I think it's a very interesting sort of divide that starts, of course, with this era that we're going to look at. So as we look at this sort of story of the conquest of the New World, you might think about some of the things we talked about going on in Europe, the changes taking place, but also I think it just sort of speaks to a world that we all inhabit. We're not in Europe, of course, so I think it's an interesting subject matter that complements what we've been talking about, and I think relates to sort of how Catholicism plays out in the New World versus in Europe, where it does kind of reach, I think, lose a lot of steam after the 1500s and 1600s because of secularization. The world becomes increasingly secular, which is to say that, not religious. So Catholicism by the 1500s, 1600s, artists are starting to get commissions from royalty and not necessarily from the church. So the church isn't necessarily the main benefactor of artists anymore. So just slowly but surely, subject matter in art shifts away from, pictures of the Bible to pictures of royalty and others. And by that time, the winds of change have already reached Latin America with the likes of Columbus. Now, also keep in mind, we've been talking about the Muslim conquest of Constantinople, and that very much triggers Columbus seeking an alternative trade route east to be able to access all those textiles from India and silk from China. And that also means the world has kind of shrunken, but Islam has certainly shrunken the world economically and connected it. That allowed for the Black Death to spread more easily, but also for more ideas to spread more easily. But also it kind of leads to the showdown between Catholicism and Islam. And I think Columbus certainly tips the balance in favor of Catholicism because you have this whole new territory that's now under the dominion of Catholicism and Catholic king. And when I say Catholicism, kind of, it's not like the Pope conquered the New World, but the kings show a lot of deference to the Pope, even at this point, especially because Spain, which is very fervently Catholic, is very much aligned with, the papacy and all that. That will shift, of course. But so now is the age of the ascendance of Spain. And I love Spanish art. It's definitely one of my favorite countries. It gets a little weird. We did painted sculptures that are really kind of almost mannequin-like. They're almost like creepy in a way, but very creepy, in fact. I'm glad you guys aren't offended by that. So what we're going to look at today, though, is the use of art to convert the Native Americans, how the Catholic art to convert Native Americans. And it looks really unlike anything you'll see in Europe, and I guess I'll let the artwork do the talking for me. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we're seeing today. So here, of course, is the world, minus North America and South America. And this is the spread of Islam around the world. And it takes place pretty rapidly. It spreads around the world in pretty much like 300, 400, very quickly. It dominates the globe. And that means more trade routes. Also, it spreads the Black Death more easily. This is the beginning of the slave trade in Africa, going down the east coast of Africa. So a lot of things change, and I'd say this is the beginning of globalization, minus, of course, the missing jigsaw pieces of the globe still. But I think if someone had thought of crossing the ocean, we might be speaking Arabic or Persian or something here in the United States. But because of this also triggers Columbus to cross the ocean, because this means the Europeans can't get all this stuff from Asia and vice versa, because you basically have this intermediary that's going to tax you to death or just, not be happy about you having free trade between the two places. Recently we had the Evergreen, I can't remember the name of the ship that blocked up the Suez Canal. So even today, that's still like, that's really the linchpin of the world in the Strait of Hormuz. Now we just, trade oil. That back then it was silk and textiles, but it's oddly similar to the world we still live in today. So anyways, you could see how Europe and basically Catholicism is shrinking down to this tiny little sliver up there, because even in Spain you have a very strong Muslim presence, and that of course is a good segue to the Reconquest. Here, who do you think we're looking at here? Anyone want to take a guess?
Crusades?
What's that?
Crusades?
Yeah, this is crusades. So most people, when you think of crusades, you think of Jerusalem, right? But in fact, there were many crusades. Wherever the Catholics and the Muslims were fighting, it was a crusade. And the Pope, ordained all these or commissioned that supported all these crusades. Officially, I don't know if they supported it with money, but basically said, yes, go fight the good fight. And so this is a painting painted in the 1800s. So keep in mind, this is not a contemporary painting. It's not contemporaneous with this event. It's rather a Spaniard in the 1800s looking back at the reconquest of Spain by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. And Queen Isabella is a very major figure. She's, I think, even more important than him as far as both her contributions to Spanish political changes, but also money. And I think she's kind of more the kind of one of the early examples of very powerful female monarch. And she's the one who gave Columbus the money to sail his ship. So this is really kind of the moment when Spain consolidates territory under the two crowns, Aragon and Castile, I think it was. Correct me if I'm wrong, or just Google it and don't let me know I was wrong. And that's I think is Boabdil. I think the name of the last Muslim king and Moorish king. You know, we have a Moorish architecture here in Tampa, the University of Tampa. And in the back, that would be the Alhambra. This is Granada. I love this picture because it really shows them both having kind of it probably wasn't as, theatrical and peaceful as this, but you could see the prize is in the back, that territory. That's what they were fighting over. So it's a very nice picture showing a kind of peaceful, and I think this is someone looking back in hindsight with rosy colored glasses at a moment that was probably not so clean and peaceful, serene, but nevertheless a very noble ending to a very bloody 800 years of fighting between Muslims and Catholics over dominion of the Iberian Peninsula. 800 years. Just imagine, like 800 years of fighting in the United States. So, and this is relevant to what we're talking about today because generation after generation of these Spaniards, are basically bred to, either fight or be aware that there's this conflict that sort of draws them into this sort of religious holy war. And you get someone like, you guys ever read Othello? You guys remember Othello, having to read that, And so Othello, it has a very important, who's the bad guy in Othello? Right, I think his name is Iago, right? Iago. Well, Iago is James in Spanish, so Santiago is Saint James. So Shakespeare very cleverly is playing with Iago there because he's well aware of this myth, which is Santiago. This is Santiago Matamoros. He's basically the guy who kills the Moors. So I think it's just so interesting to see inside of a church a guy riding on a horse cutting people's heads off. I don't think you see that in a Protestant church today, but certainly, really a symbol of the violence connected to religion, reaching a point where, you really can't disconnect the violence from religion. And, I just look at the figures down below, fearfully, trying to hide away from his sword. And just to sort of exalt this sort of icon of violence as part of, religious worship is such a fascinating example of how much that religious war of centuries of fighting just bled into the religious iconography. It's on the outside, on the inside. I think this is in Santiago in northern Spain. Beautiful city, really neat city in northern Spain, and a site of a lot of pilgrimage because that's as far as you could get into Spain without risking your life going further south. So if you ever have a chance to go to Spain, please bring me with you. I will go and I'll lecture all the time about how much fun you're having. But you could see him cutting off the heads of these Moors. So this is really this was the kind of iconography of the Holy War in Spain for many centuries until Isabella and Ferdinand finally ousted the Moors. Very eventful date, 1492. They ousted the Moors, kicked them out of Spain. They consolidated territory. They actually, I think this is when they kicked the Jews out of Spain. That's another story for another day. Because the Jews wandered around Europe, kind of like wandering away from Egypt and Israel. And then they went to France. They were kicked out there. Then they went to Germany. And we know everything worked out great for them there. But then, of course, the state of Israel is created. So that's kind of a very interesting story, too. So, Spain was kind of ruthless towards the Moors, but I think it was probably mutual ruthlessness. And, of course, when the Spanish finally reached the New World, they brought that ruthlessness with them. Or did they? That's the question for today. So I think you could see this iconography of Santiago is really important. And so in 1492, when Columbus and then, of course, thereafter Cortez and the others arrive, they are confronted with this question of what do you do with the clothlessness, the human sacrifice, and these people who are, for all intents and purposes, like pagan, right? It's sort of like, Christianity went through that sort of Christianization of Northern Europe, the British, the French, the Gauls, Spain, and the Vikings went and messed everything up, and then the Vikings got converted. So it's kind of like converting the Vikings, right? So here you have an etching of Columbus meeting the Native Americans in, probably around 1492. Now remember, it's not just Columbus. Columbus is looking for a trade route, right? Now some Spanish are looking to convert people, the friars, the different orders that come with the Spanish. And then, of course, there's the backdrop of conquest and resources. And paranoia about Islam. Even the slave trade, there was paranoia about people of Islamic belief in the slave trade, coming to the New World and bringing Islam. And in fact, there are many cases of bringing Islam to the New World by way of slaves. So that's something I think for another day. For now, we're kind of talking about the age of discovery and then the conquest of Mexico. Now, why wasn't there a conquest of Florida? By the way, I'm giving golf cart tours this summer, and it's fun for me to kind of relate all this to Florida. So why? What's that golf? The tours they do around Tampa. Sometimes you see that yellow golf cart going around. Yeah. I've been doing the tours this summer, and it's fun to kind of relate all this to Florida because Florida didn't really have this. I mean, we had Ponce de Leon, right? Fountain of Youth. I think they're still looking for that. But there was no conquest of Florida. Why not? Well, there's not much to conquer, right? Phosphate. What's that?
Not many there.
Yeah, there weren't a lot of Native Americans in Florida because there's no air conditioning, of course. Like the heck with this. So, among other reasons that makes Florida so uninhabitable, except for 3 months of the year.
And the trade currents were low.
Right, very good. So you notice we have and I like to think, when it comes to history, I really think geography is the primary thing that dictates history. And I think that's just my opinion, but I think Bruce was pointing out the trade winds really offer this amazing route that kind of just, the winds blow you to the New World and they blow you right back. But you got to go up the Straits of Florida to kind of get through the Straits of Florida and up the East Coast to really maximize the benefit. This is, I think, showing you the routes that Columbus took. But eventually they realized you can follow those trade winds, the oceans circulate clockwise in the northern hemisphere. So basically Florida was a real bummer because they thought it would have all kinds of gold and whatnot, and it didn't. So the Spanish really didn't care too much for Florida, and so they really just needed ports on the East Coast to protect the galleons from pirates and from hurricanes. That's why you have St. Augustine and other ports on the East Coast. So where were they getting the gold, if not from Florida? Very good. So from Mexico, and eventually, of course, from Peru and other places, wherever they could, right? So once they get to Cuba, they're talking to the Native Americans. The key is you need a translator, and that's really an interesting part of the story we'll get to. You need someone to translate either to Aztec or to Maya, or better still, you find someone who can speak Maya, who knows someone who can speak Aztec, and you have two translators. So Cortez eventually have sort of two intermediaries. If only he had had Google Translate, it would have been a lot easier. But of course, that didn't happen yet. We have that now. So this picture kind of foreshadows the sort of conflict that is going to take place between, of course, the Catholics and the Native Americans. So I think it's such a fascinating moment in history where you have this sort of 800 years of conflict with the Moors, and then suddenly the Spanish are like, oh, a whole new, group of people to conquer. And we're perfectly prepared for that kind of thing. It's just a fascinating and almost like almost mean-spirited to the Native Americans to have people like Cortez arrive with this sort of bloodthirsty kind of history of fighting and transfer that sort of bloodthirstiness to the New World. And, I think Cortez was a man of his time. I don't think he was interested in converting the Native Americans so much as, making a lot of money with gold. And he knew that if he'd made a lot of money with gold, whatever other sins he committed, the crown would probably forgive him for, which, that's just the nature of royalty. Nothing more to say about that. But here is another depiction of Columbus arriving. There's a great picture of this on the front of the Columbia restaurant down in Ybor. You can see, I always like seeing different portrayals of Columbus arriving. Very much kind of just a rearranging the same, like seeing a bunch of different annunciations, right? Now, is this a religious painting, would you say? That's not the point, right? I think the main point is discovery, arrival, but religion plays a part of it, right? Gold, glory, and God, I think was the refrain I heard in high school. They bring muskets. That's a powerful thing. What did the Spanish have? You might have heard the book Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Yeah.
Well, those are the big things that the Spanish brought that gave them an advantage over the Native Americans. There's the guns. There's the steel. I don't see any germs, though. I think that's the whole point, though. They are invisible. And I don't think the Spanish really knew that they were bringing smallpox. If they did, they probably would have actually been more deliberate about using it. But that definitely is the key thing that helps the Spanish kind of conquer the Aztecs. Because otherwise, we're talking about like 100, cavalry against millions of Aztecs. So how did the Spanish defeat the Aztecs? It's a really fascinating story, which really should be set to film, except it's going to offend everyone. So, and this is why. So this is another painting from the 1800s. clearly the 1800s were the century where painters were reflecting on history, as we shift from religious paintings to historical paintings, right? And there are also moral paintings, because when you look at this, I think this is actually literally Cortez. Do you think he's a good guy here? Who thinks good guy?
No.
Based on the picture, does it look like he's a good guy here?
No.
Why not?
Well, he's slaying everybody.
Right, it's kind of like, big guy, big, weapons. He shows up with a gun and the other guy shows up with a knife or even less, right? So this is, I think, really meant to show sympathy for the Native Americans. What do you notice about his body position? Whenever you see someone like this, whether it's Neo in the Matrix or, I don't know. Yeah, it's like the Christ-like pose, the crucified pose. I think it's meant to resonate with Christianity and inspire sympathy for him. Even her on the back is almost like Madonna and Child. So the artist is filtering our sense of history through a very Christian kind of sense of morality, right and wrong, virtue. And Cortez, I think, is meant to be, even though he's a knight in shining armor, looks very dashing at first, then you realize, wait, but hold on, he's not showing any compassion or sympathy. The sword is dripping. And I think you're really meant to see this. Basically, the artist here is reframing the conquest of the Aztecs as a kind of slaughter, as a massacre. It's actually called the Massacre of Cholula. So this is Cortez on his way to conquer the Aztecs. Now, at this point, he's got all kinds of allies. And that's one of the key things that allows him to defeat the Aztecs, because the enemy of my enemy, of course, is my friend. And that is what Cortez very quickly realizes. He's a lawyer. He's a very clever guy. So, you got to give him credit, because, maybe the Aztecs don't have to give him credit, but we can give him a little credit for just, achieving something which is really a jaw-dropping conquest over the Aztecs. Now, keep in mind, the Aztecs, not many people know this, the Aztecs, just before Cortez arrived, had defeated everyone else. So nobody liked the Aztecs. And so it's not, saying that the Spanish were cruel and ruthless. Well, everybody was pretty cruel and ruthless. And if you weren't, you probably were going to get, the cruelty and ruthlessness would be, you'd be the victim of it. So, anyone waving the white flag is going to get arrows or worse in this era. So the Cortez basically burns his ships. He convinces the Spanish to let him go to Mexico. But I think if I remember correctly, he doesn't get permission. They deny him permission last minute. He's like, the heck with you. I'm going to take my boats to Cuba anyways. I'm sorry, to the Yucatan Peninsula. And that's what he does here. He didn't have this map, of course. But yeah, that's his trip. He goes across to Cancun and then to Veracruz. On his way, he meets a guy named Aguirre. I can't remember his full name, but basically this maroon Spaniard had learned Maya. And he could translate from Maya to Spanish, of course, right? But they needed to translate to Aztec, which is and they meet this woman named Malinche, who's a slave to the Spanish, or a slave to the Maya, and she could speak Aztec and Maya. So she could translate from Aztec to Maya, and this other Spaniard could translate from Maya to Catholicism, Spanish, sorry. And once you have that, now Cortez is really able to acquire the needed information he needs to know, which is number one, where's the gold? That's first off. Where's the gold? That way. They're just pointing that way, like the Scarecrow in Wizard of Oz. Number two, how do I defeat them? Well, they have a lot of enemies. So he learns information and he starts allying with the enemies of the Aztecs. And at this point, Montezuma, God bless Montezuma, poor guy, he had a consolidated power before the Spanish arrived. Not long, only like a few decades before that. So yes, a lot of the enemies of the Aztecs hated the Aztecs, but also the Aztecs were also, only newly, they recently had consolidated power. So, they were not necessarily as entrenched. There was a lot more sort of flexibility, political instability maybe there at the time than a lot of people realize. And on his way to Mexico City, Cortez basically has to go run the gauntlet of conquering whoever he can that stands in his way. And you would think, how could these Spaniards cope against, thousands, if not tens of thousands of Aztecs and others who are fighting up against him? Well, one, like I said, Malinche is the key ingredient to helping him kind of translate to the Aztecs. So she's a very famous figure in Mexican history. She is the first indigenous woman who becomes nobility. And why does she become noble? Because Cortez is so grateful to her for her help that he grants her nobility. So she basically becomes, aristocracy. Now, what do you think Mexicans today think of Malinche? Good? Bad?
Traitor.
Depending on who you ask, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Very much you'll find, who do you think in Mexico thinks she's a traitor? The more, we'll say, more white-skinned Mexican, darker skin, the more Spanish descent or more indigenous descent. Well, the indigenous people generally are the ones who tend to see her as a traitor. Of course, on the other extreme, you see her as like a liberator. And then everyone in between who just keeps their mouth shut. So here is a very interesting picture by Orozco. This is one of the Mexican muralists from the 20th century, showing Cortez and Malinche. Yes, they were intimate. I'm sure that was not something she had planned, but you can see the artist depicting the two of them almost like Adam and Eve. Sort of these primal kind of pairing, and underneath them, the sort of indigenous figure down below. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you can see that he is kind of playing with the idea of kind of Adam and Eve. There's of course tension as well as sort of maybe closeness, but I think it's clearly kind of he's using coercion. And I think for us it's really hard to blame her for anything because she was a slave and just sort of a product of history. But definitely in Mexico, she's still a controversial figure. Not as controversial as Sacagawea, Pocahontas, but that's because we don't have that sort of huge empire that the Aztecs still had. Remember, it did very quickly decline because of smallpox, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So these are some drawings that some of these friars and the missionaries did along with while they joined, along with his retinue of people who went into Mexico City. And you notice, African descent, this is, of course, something that reflects the presence of Moors in Africa. And these are not, they look like enslaved Native Americans. They're actually allies who were allying with Cortez because they were happy to help him conquer the Aztecs because they all hated the Aztecs because the Aztecs had conquered them. And who is that in the front? Well, there's Cortez and Malinche right there in the front. And here's a picture that shows you the kind of overwhelming force of the Native Americans against the Spaniards. And if you read Cortez's diaries, which you can in Spanish or in English, what he does is basically he fires a cannon whenever it gets too overwhelming. And once the cannon fires, Native Americans go, I've never heard anything like that before. So they run. They're like, whoo, we're out of here. And it sort of became theatrical, almost like psychological warfare. In addition to the fact that they had never seen someone on horseback before. Just imagine you go into a battle and you see tanks for the first time. That's kind of what horses were like. And in addition to that, the arrows wouldn't penetrate the steel armor. So think about being a Native American. Like, I got him, boom, it bounces right off. I'm done. Cannon, boom, I'm really done. I'm joining the Spanish, right? So, and of course, agony on top of insult on top of agony. Smallpox really, affected everyone. Of course, the Spanish were probably excluded from that because they had a kind of they were immune from something like that. They had their own tolerance. But of course, the Native Americans weren't. And it spread very slowly and, spread to the Allies as well as to the Aztecs. For the Spaniards, what mattered, of course, is that the smallpox spread to the Aztecs. So you can see Malinche there in the back. Very interesting pictures, right? Of course, these are all very one-sided. But of course, even though we say one-sided, we're still talking about the allies of the Spanish fighting against the Aztecs. Now, at this point, that's not Malinche, but another example of a Peruvian indigenous woman who becomes, she basically, one sign of the conversion is the outward attire of conversion, right? So yeah, Montezuma at this point has heard about Cortez. He's got all kinds of, emissaries, and he doesn't know what to do. I think he's got the same attitude as Cortez, like sort of like a game of chess, trying to get resources, trying to figure out what these guys want, trying to buy them off. It's a lot like the Vikings, and the British, like pay them off. And of course, does that stop the Vikings? No, of course not. So the best thing you can do is kind of convert people. Now here, what are we looking at here? Anyone ever been to Mexico City? You're probably good if you haven't, because I've heard I haven't heard many great things about Mexico City, but maybe that's changing. But Mexico City looks nothing like this now. But it is still located in a lake. So they basically took this lake, and now there's really bad drainage in Mexico City because they basically built on top of a lake. And this lake was the capital of the Aztec Empire, which you can see there in the very middle there. So they basically, the Mexican flag, those two, I think it still has the eagle on it. It's really a reflection of this myth in Mexico of this eagle and a cactus and a snake, and that was where they built their capital. So they had these sort of two causeways that led to the capital. And it's really remarkable. I mean, there were a lot of floating gardens. It was very strategically located. This is a painting by Diego Rivera, kind of trying to resurrect the forgotten memory of Tenochtitlan. That's the name of the capital of the Aztecs, which is basically buried underneath Catholic ruins now. Now, interestingly, we'll see that the Spanish built their cathedrals right on top of the sacred precinct of the Aztecs, very symbolically to let them know we've defeated you. Not only that, after Cortez dies in Spain, they take his body from Spain and float it back to Mexico and then put it in the sacred precincts of the capital of the Aztec, just to remind them, the guy who defeated you, his body will be here forever. And, again, the symbolism of conquest. And so here, these two stripes are actually the causeways that lead to the capital. So, this is still actually on the Mexican flag today. So when you see the Mexican flag, you're actually looking at kind of an Aztec flag. I think that's really neat. So the conquest of here's some pictures of the details of the capital of the Aztec. Pyramids that are a little different than the Egyptian pyramids. You're supposed to climb up on the top. And these are very typical of the New World in Mexico and beyond. And a lot of myths kind of foreshadowing the arrival of Cortez. I don't want to get too far into it. But the architecture and the kind of details of Aztec art is really unlike anything in Europe and almost terrifying. Some people say this kind of snaky serpent refers to maybe a memory of a meteorite hitting the New World. And there's a lot of evidence to support that a meteorite actually wiped out. When I was growing up, going to school at Gorey and Wilson, they taught us that the woolly mammoths in the New World were just destroyed by what? What do you guys remember what they taught us growing up? What's that? I was taught overhunting, like human beings killed them, exterminated them from, and they're very likely, we do that. That's what human beings do. When people arrive to Florida, they cut down all the cedar trees, and they harvested all the clams, and you're left with clamless, cedarless beaches. And so I think now it looks like, in fact, the big mammoths and other large game in the New World were destroyed by a meteorite impact in 10,000 BC. So there could be a kind of memory of like a comet that this all relates to, which is really fascinating to me, but also leads to a very scary looking sculpture, which is just terrifying. Even the gods were quite scary. And I think you have to think about this from the Spanish perspective, looking at trying to reconcile their own religion with this new religion. And immediately it's not Christianity, and it's polar opposite in a way because of human sacrifice. And even the gods are pretty terrifying. They have a lot of skeletons, and she has snakes on her skirt. And if anything, the Spanish were probably like, oh, a snake god? You guys are like the devil. I'm sure. And that, of course, that was very convenient, too, for them because, Cortez was looking for any reason to justify conquest. And now, keep in mind, the missionaries who came after were a lot more compassionate and I think really tried to atone for a lot of the ruthlessness of Cortez.
And remember, the snake goes back to the Garden of Eden.
Well, yeah, exactly. So we're almost like you've got all these kind of almost this coincidental kind of connection to the Garden of Eden, to snakes, and of course, what do you do to counterbalance that? Well, you bring in you try to find positive connections, right? We'll see that in a moment. So a lot of this remained buried even until the last few decades. They're still discovering relics or traces of Aztec culture underneath Catholic churches. The Spanish would literally reuse a lot of the Aztec buildings and rebuild cathedrals with the Aztec stone and mason work. So they recycled a lot of it. Here's Cortez meeting with Montezuma, and Montezuma was kind of a pushover. I think he was, he didn't. It's not his fault. It's really smallpox that I think ultimately shifted the tide because I think Montezuma felt like, okay, what's going to happen? There's only like 100 guys. Yeah, they have horses. Yeah, they've got these floating mountains they thought, which are the boats. But, still 100 guys or so. What can they do? Without realizing, of course, you've got germ warfare that's slowly spreading around the Aztec Empire. And, of course, once he gets to the capital of the Aztecs, that smallpox, it's a super spreading situation, right? So here you've got human sacrifice. And yeah, if you read the diaries of Cortez, they were absolutely appalled by the practice of human sacrifice. And there's something, there's a religious component to that of releasing the spirit, which, restores balance to the universe, all that kind of stuff. But very appalling to Christians who I think probably felt like, we had already, dealt with this kind of problem, this pagan practice, if you will, 1,000 years before. So here we are once again confronting the same kind of dilemma they faced in Europe. And it basically leads to this all-out battle for the Aztec Empire. Interestingly, it was a naval battle. So it wasn't a land battle. It was primarily a naval battle because basically Cortez, I'll get back to the battle in a moment, a week or so, can't remember exactly when, Cortez has to sneak out of the Aztec Empire because he realizes we're going to all get destroyed if we don't get away. Now, at that point, actually, it's not Cortez. Cortez had already left because he heard that the Cuban governor had sent people to go get him because they were really mad that he took the ships and burned them so his troops wouldn't go back to Cuba. So the Cuban governor sent more ships, and Cortez meets them and says, hey, we've been to the Aztec Empire. We've seen the capital. There is like gold beyond your wildest dreams there. So why don't you just join us? And they're like, okay. So they said, the heck with the Cuban governor, and they joined Cortez, and now he has all the reinforcements he needs, along with the allies he had with the Aztecs, and he returns to the Aztec capital just in time to save this other guy. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. He would go on to conquer conquer Guatemala, Pedro Alvarado, I think. Nevertheless, Cortez meets with them, and they had just escaped by the skin of their teeth on the causeway. In the middle of the night, someone like kicked in a rock, and then the Aztecs all sound the alarms, and they start going after them and barely get out of the city alive, and they meet up with Cortez, who at that point has all these reinforcements, more guns, more cannons, more Spaniards, more armor, more horses, and then along with the allies they've already made, they go on to fight against Montezuma, who at that point had been stoned to death by his own people who had lost faith in him. But the Aztecs at that point are also suffering from smallpox. And so Cortez basically has all of his allies and the Spanish build a bunch of ships, and it's a naval battle for the conquest of Tenochtitlan. And as you probably know, the Spanish win. And very quickly, all of this is basically in ruins, and eventually this is what you see in Mexico City. Now the Zocalo, that's the main plaza in Mexico City, that's really built right on top of the Aztec main central precinct, or the very most sacred place of the Aztecs. So it's almost like if Muslims conquered, Rome, and they built a mosque on top of the Vatican. That's very painful to imagine. I'm sure the Aztecs likewise felt a lot of real deep pain about that. And underneath the Catholic Church, you see all kinds of relics and reminders of the Aztec religion. Underneath the columns. And all this was deliberately, hidden or recycled to kind of insult against the Aztec religion. And of course, the Spanish Catholics who arrived, not the conquerors, but the friars of mission, Jesuits, a few other orders that are really important. But I think the Jesuits are the one that a lot of people think of when they think of the New World. By the way, you should watch the movie The Mission. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. It's a great movie, great soundtrack, very interesting movie. I think shows the two sides of conquest, the sort of compassion or sort of more kind of Machiavellian, ruthlessness. And I think all the Spanish, missionaries who come after the conquerors have to address this question of, how do we convert the remaining Native Americans, or what do we do with them? Queen Isabella originally said, if you convert to Catholicism, then you get liberated. You won't be a slave, right? But of course, that presents a problem with how we're going to exploit all these people for labor, right? We still need, if you don't have gold, how are we going to mine the gold if we don't have people to exploit? That's an interesting subject we'll get to maybe another day. But so you kind of have this age of evangelization, right? Converting Native Americans, and going back to what we were just talking about, there's a lot of negative things like sacrifice, the devil, the snakes, but then there's also some other bridges, cultural bridges you can walk across, namely birds and feathers. So this is actually Montezuma's headdress made out of quetzals. I don't think quetzals are very hard to find now because they've been hunted to extermination. But this is the sacred bird of the Aztecs, and it probably took, thousands of hours to collect this many feathers just to make a headdress, but very symbolic of power. And, the Catholics realized, we can use the feathers that the Aztecs use in their artwork and blend it with Christian paintings. And the result is something you'll never see in Europe, which is basically, I guess it's a Jesus made with hummingbird feathers, right? So they individually pluck the feathers of hummingbirds. The hummingbird's a real, victim in this story. But I just love seeing this sort of iconography, which is similar to what stuff we've seen, maybe like a Botticelli or something, but now done with this feather art. And the whole point is basically saying, look, it's the same, your religion and our religion, you're just kind of, look, it's the same stuff. The feathers, look, the feathers are sort of a connection. So, there's all kinds of examples like this in Christianity too, sort of, the Nikes, the angels from the Roman religion become the angels in the Christian religion, and there's all kinds of other cases of sort of, one religion blending into the next and offering some kind of familiarity that offers maybe a bridge from one culture to the next. You also think about literacy, converting, teaching kids, little indigenous kids Spanish, gives them the ability to read. And just imagine what a difference is when you can read and your parents can't, kind of thing. That's such a big part of conversion that is kind of overlooked, because once you become literate, you've really kind of become so different than others who aren't literate. I gotta love the yellow eyes. Such an interesting little touch there. I don't know if he's like, that's meant to be like, yeah, it's almost like he's drunk or something. But yeah, it's really neat to see the feather work. And so yeah, the Aztecs had a really rich tradition of painting feathers or just using the feathers as they were. It's hard to appreciate the iridescence, but I just think it's such a unique example of Christian artwork that has all this sort of texture and color that you wouldn't see in Christianity in Europe. So here's Jesus bleeding, and this blood here is probably cochineal, which is the color red from the cactus. And so even though you have this exchange of sort of Europeans transplanting stuff to the New World, it also goes the other way. It looks like that guy's kind of yelling at Jesus. So very interesting to see how it's portrayed in the New World, right? Maybe the money lender there, I'm guessing, right? But this color, I think another example, it looks like red, but it's also, I think the Aztec would say, oh, that's the sacred color that we see as a sacred red, and now they're using it for Jesus. Another example of kind of blending the two religions. Here is the cactus that yields the cochineal, which is that red color that you get from these bugs that you have to sort of smash and get the red color, right? And in fact, the Europeans started using this color because it lasted a lot longer than the red that they used. So this color red will go on to become a major part of religious paintings or just paintings in Europe. At the same time, here it is in the Aztec culture and in Maya culture too, the guy there in the middle. This is them doing a sacrifice. It wasn't just sacrificing the whole body. The nobility could just do a little blood, a little prick, a little blood sacrifice. That's it. That's my little sacrifice. Genius. Yeah, I love these two guys talking. They're like gossiping. They're like, hey, how's the family? Yeah, it's great.
I like their hats.
Yeah, no, it's great. This is not Christian art, so we can't spend too much time. Very interesting subject is Maya paintings from very early. These survived because they were in the middle of nowhere. The Spanish deliberately destroyed as much as they could, but they missed out on these. And here's some other examples of the red that you see in the Aztec. And there is some interesting parallels. I mean, maybe you don't quite see it here. It's almost like a Last Judgment quality here. Like these are the souls that kind of get damned or something, and there's heaven up there. Definitely kind of interesting parallels. But here you see the red here from European paintings, and in fact that's Aztec red. So there's a exchange that goes both directions. You know, tomatoes, corn come from the New World, and some people say syphilis. Although there's a lot of debate about this. But here's the red. You know, it's interesting now. You know, they're not using the red to connect to Christians in terms of Aztec, but they're using Aztec colors to enhance the Christian painting. So it's interesting to think that it goes both ways. And yeah, I think the red is much richer and more long-lasting. So that replaces whatever red they were using in Europe. We're going to be looking at work by Caravaggio next week, so we'll get back to this. But he's a really interesting painter. Here he's literally got this is Doubting Thomas. You know, and the Doubting Thomas is always one pointing out, and here Jesus is, guiding his finger into him to prove, offering proof. And that's a very interesting subject we talked about a few weeks ago, the idea of proof as a way visualizing religion and offering proof. Well, here is a really great example. Not only is Doubting Thomas given proof, literally, but the painting itself is proof of this moment taking place, right? So that'll be for next week to talk about. And there, of course, more of the red, El Greco.
Alex,
and yes.
Was this about the time that cochineal made its way to Europe?
Yes, exactly. That's because of the conquest of the New World. They're like, oh, we got this new red color that we can use. So it's sort of like, going to China and getting the silk. There's interesting Justinian, the guy who built the Hagia Sophia that we saw, the one in Turkey, Istanbul. He sends not Marco Polo but the equivalent to go steal the secret recipe of the silk trade, and there's sort of industrial sabotage going on. The Byzantine Empire wanted to make its own silk without depending on the Chinese, and so they actually achieved that. I don't know much more about the story than that. That was where my interest waned at that point. But yeah, so you can't stay interested in one subject forever because then you got to eat and all those other things. So that's where I stopped. But maybe I'll pick up on that and share you what I learned. So yeah, we looked at Salvator Mundi, I think a few weeks ago, and here's the sort of Aztec, if you will, version of Salvator Mundi. You really can't appreciate the feathers without sort of having that sort of holographic shifting, which I think I have an example which I'll show you in a moment. But I just think it's so interesting to see. So the kind of same picture, but in a totally different kind of, not totally different language, but kind of halfway between two worlds, if you will. And this captures the sort of iridescence of the feathers a little better, and the details. Yeah, very similar, maybe not quite the same subject, but this is the Aztec painting of people. So this is kind of shows you the sacrifice. These figures are all releasing this mana or some kind of magical energy, it's like their soul, and that's why they do sacrifice, to release that energy. And here in this book, you can see some other examples of the feather art. Here, let's look more like quail or something like that. But yeah, this one shows you the sort of, that's how it really, that's kind of how it looks, like almost holographic quality to the texture. And so they use this kind of feather art to convert the Native Americans, to offer some kind of familiarity between Christianity and Aztec art. And the ones who survived, the Aztecs who survived, for a generation, there were skilled masons who contributed their own Aztec masonry to Christianity. And that's what we're seeing here. This is an Aztec artist interpreting Christianity in his own way. And here are the friars, like burning, setting alight Aztec art, because one part of conversion is maybe eliminating anything that might compete or contradict your own narrative. So there's a certain kind of tragedy to it, I think, in terms of preserving Aztec culture, but just the reality of the Spanish. I think you have to kind of give the Spanish, this hindsight, right? It's very easy to condemn the past because of hindsight. Of course, one day we will be condemned too. So I think you have to kind of understand people are living in a different age. This is amaranth. This is a grain, and that was outlawed because it was associated with Aztec ritual. So there's a very deliberate attempt to sort of, we remove from sight anything Aztec, anything religious, to the point that it's basically buried underground. And it's not until the Mexican Revolution in 1910 that sort of they rediscover and start celebrating the Aztec contribution to Mexican society. But interestingly enough, I just want to share an important part of the history. Smallpox wiped out the population. I mean, you can see in 1500, roughly, 22 million people, and then in 50 years, 60 years later, down to maybe 2 million people. So pretty, definitely way bigger than COVID, and very much like the Black Death, or worse than that. But so the equivalent of Black Death. And very importantly, here's the Spanish Empire. So Catholicism, even as it's kind of a best of times, worst of times scenario, because even while Catholicism is on the rise, you've also got Martin Luther, who of course is another major sort of balance of power shift away from Catholicism. But for now, you can see this guy, King Philip, or King Carlos V, Carlos V of Spain, I think his son or grandson is Philip II, they have now control. I mean, look, it goes from Spain. Remember, we saw that map of Europe shrinking to this. Now suddenly you've got two more continents of power, and it's not just, of course, the crown's power and, domination of the oceans and land masses, but also all these new people to be converted, and this, what do you do with the Native Americans? Originally we saw Isabella told them, if you convert, you're no longer slaves. But of course, there's also people in the New World who want, merchants and people who are really interested in money. Here you can see the mission system. Sadly, we don't really have, I don't know, maybe there is and I don't know, but in California, there are missions, Spanish missions that are still there, and they're a day apart by design, so you can walk from one to the next and, maybe survive being, killed by pirates or whatever. And so these missions are all throughout Mexico, a day apart from each other. And here this is Bartolomé de las Casas. We'll end on this subject because he's the one who joined Columbus on his, I can't remember which journey, but basically was there with Columbus and witnessed a lot of the atrocities committed against the Native Americans. So here's an interesting moment where, if you're an indigenous Mexican, even in spite of all the bad things that the Spanish did, they see him as a kind of a liberator, savior, because he wrote a letter here. He's literally writing a letter to Juan Carlos, or I can't remember, Carlos V, and he's basically saying, "Dear Mr. King, please do not continue to enslave and hurt the Native Americans, right? That it's really, they are noble, who just they are people who just need to be converted, and it's a real sin against Christianity. I'm paraphrasing, sin against Christianity to treat them in such a horrible way, right? And if he had stopped the letter right there, we could all take a sigh of relief and be like, wow, he's great. And that's how a lot of Native Americans in Mexico see him. He's definitely seen as someone who in spite of being Catholic, was very supportive of their plight and understood. Unfortunately, there's another paragraph to the letter. What, what do you think that paragraph says?
Convert or die?
No, well, close. You're on the right track. So he suggests basically here, again, the territory just keeps expanding. Florida. Now, right here this was part of that map. I think that's so interesting to think we right here, territorially speaking, we're part of this empire, and of course, California, Mexico, all of this, including Brazil. And so, what do you do? Remember, we talked about Islam spreading into Africa, right? Beginning of the slave trade there. Well, basically, he says, well, instead, and I don't mean to joke about this, but it's just so shocking how what a sort of almost tone deaf from our standards, but he basically says, instead of enslaving Native Americans, I got an idea. Let's enslave other people. And that's the beginning of the African slave trade in the New World. So you kind of go from...
Distraction?
What's that?
Kind of as a distraction?
Well,
Get
it's...
them from over there.
Well, it's sort of like, replacing one evil for another. On top of the smallpox, on top of, maybe losing your territory, you follow the empire. Now, on top of that, the New World is a very bloody birth. It's very painful birth, both the, smallpox, genocide, and now slavery. And so when you look at this is basically because of him. Like I said, the Native Americans love him, but the Africans, no, definitely not, and rightly so. So when you look at this, what do you notice up here? Can you see the map, the part on the right, well enough to kind of, any takeaways from that? Where did the majority of slaves go in the New World? Yeah, to Brazil, to the Caribbean. One slave is too many, right? Of course, the history of the world is a history of slavery, but usually it's slavery because of conquest, not necessarily literally treating people as commodities to be traded, and that definitely is a new sort of twist on slave trade. Nevertheless, you could see the slaves really went where, primarily wherever sugar, because they noticed the Native Americans couldn't work on the sugar plantations without dying or perishing. Now, interestingly, in Haiti, for instance, the French were particularly cruel. Not coincidentally, you have the first slave rebellion in Haiti. The French, even though 10% of the slave population died every year, instead of being like, let's fix things to make it safer, they were like, no, let's just import more slaves. So that was the cruelty of the French, right? So definitely this is a big part of the New World, maybe not necessarily related to Christianity, except in the sense that there was some paranoia about the slaves having Islamic influence and bringing that to the New World. And there was certainly paranoia about this, but really what we're looking at is sort of substituting, the labor of the Native Americans for slave labor. And this becomes the sort of fabric of the New World until, of course, the United States adds another element to this. And just very briefly, I just want to show you kind of one interesting byproduct of this in a moment. But here, we think about Columbus. This is kind of Columbus's dream realized, be able to connect one ocean to the next. But the best thing you can do to really realize this Columbus's dream is the Panama Canal, of course, and that brings the United States from that Jeffersonian republic to the sort of empire that we have today. And the Panama Canal allows that sort of Columbian dream of connecting the two continents, or at least Europe and India and Asia together. Pacific Ocean is unfortunately very large, but once you can find a ship to cross it, you will. And this is the sort of fabric of the New World. You've got justice, the sort of system of law. You've got the church, and then the casta system. And although it's not Christian painting, I think it's worth checking out because you could have to think about how it relates to Christianity, because you have this whole series of paintings that come out in the next 100 years after the conquest, which are meant to kind of make sense of this emerging New World with all these different identities. At the top, of course, are the Peninsulares from Spain. Below that are the people of Spanish of descent, but were born in the New World. It's kind of like nouveau riche, old money, new money. And then below them are the Native Americans, and then the mixed, mestizo, blending, and then below them are mulattoes. I think here you say mixed race today. And of course, wherever there's slaves, you have them at the very bottom. Now in Mexico, there weren't a lot of slaves because there wasn't a lot of sugar. There are some exceptions, but definitely in Cuba, Brazil, you have a huge slave population. And they make all these paintings called casta paintings, which are really kind of distasteful in a lot of ways. This isn't a casta painting. It's almost reminiscent of what we're going to see, these casta paintings, because they're really meant to kind of make sense of people in terms of sort of these superficial differences. And I will ask you, as you look at these, think, are these Christian paintings? And I think when you look at them, there's a lot of red in there. So I'll just show you a few of them here. Yeah, so
The
here.
word casta, the
Caste.
same word is like caste.
Caste, right.
The
So they
caste
kind of has this
system.
caste system, which, we
CAST.
don't have that. We had slavery and, non-slaves in the United States. But in Mexico and other places in Latin America, it's much more convoluted, much more of a mix of different groups. And I think the whole idea was a paranoia about being the elites in power and trying to visualize, whatever, either reinforcing your elite status. So, basically, what we're looking at pictures of people in the New World and the blending of the different cultures because of sort of intimacy. And it's almost like I said before, it's almost like Adam and Eve, but for a new world. And I know I have a phone in here somewhere. I'm going to shut up. All right, there we go. I'll call you back in a moment. Whoever it is. So, yeah.
Were the
Yeah.
slaves not as prone to get smallpox?
Good. Well, I don't think so because depending on where you were, if you're in North Africa, you're probably less susceptible. If you're in Southern Africa, probably more susceptible because you're not as close to the trading routes. So I think the closer you are to the trading routes, the more likely you are to be immune or have some level of tolerance. Native Americans were completely isolated for thousands of years, whereas in Africa, even though it's sub-Saharan Africa is definitely farther removed, if you're in Northern Africa, you're much more part of that sort of trading. So it's really wherever trade exists, you're going to have more exposure to things, and of course it depends individually on your immune system, diet, and all kinds of things. But certainly in Africa, I'm sure that smallpox, other things spread wherever people traded, and there wasn't much you could do with that. Now I'm sure there's some exceptions where Africans perished in large numbers because of smallpox. I just don't know too much about that. But you notice above it says Spanish and mestiza produces a castiz, I think is the name. And so basically these are showing like if you got a Spaniard and you got a Native American indigenous woman, you get this. And so really kind of, I want to hear what you guys think. So these are all pictures showing you basically if you take this and you add this, you get this. So African woman, Spaniard, there's very few Spanish women here because it's really the Spanish men who went to the New World. And you notice they're not religious paintings, right? These aren't Catholic paintings, right? And I know this is kind of Christian art, but just show you something that's very oddly not Christian. It shows it's really not about using any Christian morality to make sense of this. It's really just sort of like, almost human taxidermy, right? Zoology of people. And very kind of, I think, so kind of bizarre and almost creepy because it's not treating people like real subjects so much as just sort of like their race. And interestingly, some of them are more satirical or funny or, here it's kind of showing you like the lower you are in the ranks, the more likely you are to violence and alcoholism. And some of them were definitely emphasizing that, like the mom is there cooking and the kid is going to the European dad to seek some kind of, comfort. Likewise here, it's the European guy is always, Spanish guy is always like the sort of like peacemaker. She looks like she's upset with him. Baby. There's nothing negative about this. It seems very wholesome. So it's not like they're mean-spirited, but there's just something so superficial about them that they don't feel like real people so much as just sort of reducing someone to their race. And I think conspicuously, there's no hint of religion whatsoever. So for me, it just shows that there's a sort of almost secular paranoia about these different races. And it's almost like, treating people with an exotic lens, the way they're treating the food or the landscape in the background. Here, in fact, you've got, the baby is darker skinned because she's albina. So she's, the light skin is actually, she's indigenous, and that's why the baby is darker skinned. So, this is the kind of thing that sets in motion a Mexico that's very much defined by skin color and, are you Spanish descent, are you not? And when we get there, we can think about how that relates to the United States. It's a little different twist on kind of the racial composition of the country, indigenous too, but of course there's an element of seeking religious sanctuary from persecution, which is not at all the case with the Catholics coming to the New World. So very different world emerges in Latin America, and it's really not until 1898 with the Spanish-American War that we kind of start to kind of overcome that difference between one and the other. Here's a rare case of a Spanish woman who looks like she's got some philandering husband there that she's upset with, but really, bizarre pictures, and you agree, there's nothing really religious about these, right? Yes, question?
Yeah, are these the basic purpose to promote acceptance of
To promote which?
To promote acceptance of interrelations?
Yeah, I think it's basically kind of like reinforcing segregation, reinforcing the Spanish.
Well, so they were cautionary.
Pardon me?
Are they cautionary? Are they promoting? Are they promoting acceptance?
No, I think they were, I think they're saying, look, so I think you kind of have to imagine like the king on his throne or somewhere very far away hearing about the New World and someone saying, oh, I want to show you what's going on and let me show you the blending. I think it would be almost like it's almost like if you go to Europe and you meet someone in Germany, and they're like, "You're American because you're a blend of like things that we don't blend, you know,
Okay.
Italian and Irish. They don't blend necessarily in Europe necessarily. They do now, right? But it's almost like when I go to Europe, they look at me oddly, like, "What are you? Like, you're too short to be American, but you're not meant like this." And so I think that's kind of like what they're doing, and I hope they don't.
Who commissioned them?
What's that?
Who made
Right,
them?
so I think it was mainly like the aristocracy commissioning these as a way to kind of look down on everyone below, and also, you know, the Spaniards are always given this heavenly, like sort of white light, and you know the other subjects are treated, you know, it's not like it's mean, like I don't think they're like looking down, and it's more like exotic. These are like postcards from the New World kind of thing. And unlike any, you don't see anything like this in the United States. Maybe some equivalent of like maybe during the 1900s of like showing photography that, you know, there's definitely some interesting cases of imagery that does kind of speak to the age of segregation. Of course, famous picture of the girl being ushered to school by the federal agents, but that's a different kind of domain than this sort of this era, you know, the 1600s, 1500s. And so, yeah, I think you can see that it's always a kind of Spaniard with a kind of Native American women, and kind of like a repeat of Cortez and Malinche, but nothing at all religious about it, which I think is so interesting. And importantly, in some cases, we're going to see them educating the child. You know, like for instance, having paranoia about having a midwife who is indigenous, an indigenous woman, maybe even breastfeeding her child. Those kinds of issues came up in you know, in the New World. And maybe the equivalent here would be like, you know, if you're African American, you adopt a white child, or if you're white, you adopt an African American child, kind of thing. Those kind of subtle little nuanced moments that you see. And you know, here's fully indigenous here, so definitely a big range of subject matter. And I think that's what Orozco here is speaking about. That was set in motion by this kind of coercive intimacy between the two groups. And that sets in motion a whole story that is kind of Mexico. And I think the question is, does that also relate to the United States? Well, not quite. Even Frida Kahlo, who's another famous artist from Mexico, I think wrestling with the same dilemma, her European ancestry and her indigenous ancestry. And I think we can all relate to this because it's like how much of your, you know, we assimilate to become American, but it's up to you to sort of preserve your heritage at home or elsewhere. You know, sometimes recent immigrants learn English, but the family speaks a different language at home. So I think she's kind of visualizing that struggle between European identity and indigenous identity. Here it might be, you know, how much of your sort of character connects to your Americanness versus your sort of roots. And of course, almost by definition, in the United States, we're sort of all about being American and not necessarily being, you know, French or German. Of course, you know, you might feel the other way. But I think in Mexico, it's much more of a kind of contrast and a sort of hurdle to overcome, sort of emphasizing one or the other. And in this case, she's actually, I think, cutting her ties to the woman on the right. So I think that's a good place to end. And next week we'll go back to Europe and talk about the Counter-Reformation. So basically, and it's a little, you know, getting away from this, but basically the Catholic Church is going to come down hard on Protestantism and hard on artwork. And we're going to see a new wave of artwork, which is meant to reinforce the Catholic Church. But I think at that point, it's also, you know, the Church has lost a lot of that kind of winds, have kind of shifted to secular subjects, or even just the patrons of art will now be royalty and not necessarily the Church. But in the New World, the Church does have a sort of new lease on life, but we'll be focusing next week on the Counter-Reformation. So thank you. Any questions? Very interesting subject, right? New World?
Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? You good? All right, good. Thank you, guys, and thank you, Bruce. Can I disconnect this?